From distress-driven deals to deliberate dominance. Over the next 5 episodes of Biomanufacturing and Fermentation Technology by Prasad Arnala, we'll reveal how rethinking biotech licensing as a primary path can safeguard IP, empower founders, and fuel sustainable innovation.
Welcome to The Debate. Today we're looking at a hemorrhage in the biotechnology sector. We're talking about billions of dollars in public investment and, frankly, untold human potential that's just being lost. And not because the science failed, but because the architecture of the companies themselves, it just collapsed. We're dissecting that friction between scientific validation, does the technology work, and the governance structures. Who owns it? How's it financed? And can it actually be sold?
When we say governance, we're not talking about board meeting minutes or, filing forms in triplicate. We're talking about the fundamental machinery of ownership and control. We're really debating whether the infamous valley of death for startups is actually a capital problem, which is the common belief, or if it's, as the source material argues, more of a design flaw in how we structure innovation itself.
That is the core tension, exactly. The prevailing narrative in the ecosystem is that startups die because they run out of money. It's a resource scarcity story. But the source material, this really detailed policy perspective on value leakage, argues that capital scarcity is often a symptom, not the root cause. The root cause is a misalignment. Technical validation moves at lightning speed. You get the data, you prove the concept in the lab. But the governance, the IP rights, the cap table, the chain of title, it often lags years behind the science.
And the argument is that this lag creates a sort of toxicity that scares away capital. But I want to set the stakes for my side of the table early on. I agree that bad legal hygiene kills companies. I've seen it happen. However, the proposed solution, heavier government intervention and private contracts, mandatory audit, and using research grants to pay for M&A lawyers, it risks turning the whole grant system into a bureaucratic nightmare. I mean, we have to ask, do we want scientists focused on the cure for cancer, or do we want them focused on the fine print of their liquidation preference stack?
Well, I would argue that if they ignore the liquidation preference stack, that cure for cancer never reaches the patient, because the company implodes before a phase 2 trial. My position today is that we need what the source calls a dual risk paradigm. We've spent 50 years optimizing for scientific risk. We're great at funding experiments and judging data. We are terrible at managing governance risk. We need a structural overhaul that mandates IP audits and funds transaction readiness to make sure that what we invent in the lab creates value that can actually be captured by the economy that funded it.
And my position is really one of caution when it comes to implementation. I believe the governance gap is real, but I am deeply skeptical that public policy can or even should try to micromanage the complex, high-stakes negotiations of the private market. If we start redefining success to include selling off our best assets to foreign entities just to say we save the value, we might just be hollowing out our own industrial base in the name of efficiency.
So let's begin by unpacking this concept of the governance-dependent asset. This is a critical mental shift presented in the material. In academia, a breakthrough is, a victory in itself. You publish, you get citations, you get tenure. But in the commercial world, validated science isn't an asset unless it's wrapped in 3 specific layers of governance.
Right. Those being IP control, financial rights, and transaction timing.
Precisely. And if any one of those layers is defective, the scientific data, no matter how brilliant, is effectively worthless to an investor. The material identifies this phenomenon called value leakage. This is what happens when a startup enters that translational phase, moving from the lab to the market with strong data, but really weak governance. And here's the counterintuitive insight that really struck me.
In this specific scenario, more positive scientific data can actually accelerate the company's demise.
Ah, that's the phrase that caught my eye. Valuable enough to steal, but not protected enough to retain.
Exactly. I mean, imagine a startup with messy IP ownership. Maybe a former grad student never signed an invention assignment agreement. Suddenly they get a breakthrough result. The company is now worth, say, $50 million on paper. That former grad student looks at the news and realizes they have massive leverage. They own a piece of the foundation. The ambiguity that was just annoying at a $2 million valuation is absolutely fatal at a $50 million valuation. The leakage amplifies as the science succeeds.
I see the mechanism you're describing. It paints a target on the company's back. But I think we need to look at why this happens. The material suggests founders over-optimize for technical milestones. They think, if I just get the data, the money will sort itself out. You're arguing this is a failure of system design? I would argue this is a failure of prioritization by the founders. Why is this a public policy emergency rather than just bad business practice that the market rightfully punishes?
Because the market punishment involves the destruction of public investment. If the NIH or a national innovation agency pours $5 million into that research and the company dissolves because of a preventable legal error, the taxpayer loses that $5 million. The science is stranded. It sits in a bankruptcy court or gets picked up for pennies by a foreign competitor. This isn't just bad business. It's a systemic inefficiency in how we translate public research into private value.
So you view the government not just as a grant maker, but as a fiduciary that needs to protect the asset it helped create?
It has to be. The material explicitly states that cash depletion leads to staff attrition, documentation gaps, and patent lapse. When these companies enter the valley of death, they aren't just running low on cash, they are deteriorating structurally. If we don't intervene with governance support, we're just pouring water into a bucket that has a hole in the bottom.
But let's look at the value of death through a different lens. The source material describes it as a coordination failure. I often see it as a valuation reality check. Often, these governance issues, messy cap tables, unclear IP, are used by investors as leverage to drive down the price. It's part of the brutal efficiency of the market. If your house has a leaky roof, the buyer pays less. You seem to be suggesting the government should pay to fix the roof before the sale to ensure the founder gets a better price?
I'm suggesting the government should ensure the roof can be fixed so the house doesn't collapse entirely. This brings us to the first major policy hypothesis: mandatory IP audits. The proposal is simple but radical. Establish a hard gate at late-stage funding. If you want Series A support or a major translational grant, you must pass a formal IP and ownership audit.
And this is where the rubber meets the road and, potentially creates a traffic jam. A hard gate implies that if a company has a cure for a rare disease but has undocumented tacit know-how, meaning the lead scientist keeps the recipe in their head, you would cut off their funding?
Yes, because if their recipe is only in their head, it isn't an asset, it's a dependency. The source material highlights undocumented tacit know-how as a massive risk factor. If that scientist gets hit by a bus or simply gets a better offer from a competitor, the public's investment just evaporates. Mandating an audit forces the company to document that know-how, ensuring the asset exists independent of the individual.
Theoretically, that sounds prudent. Operationally, it sounds like a nightmare. Startups are dynamic, chaotic entities. They're fighting for survival. Now you want to introduce a rigorous legal audit as a precondition for cash? You risk killing the patient to cure the infection. A gate stops the flow of resources. If a startup is 2 weeks from payroll insolvency and you tell them, wait, we need to clarify the chain of title on a patent from 2022, they go bust. The audit triggers the very failure you're trying to prevent.
But if they go bust after receiving the money because of that title defect, the result is worse. The money is burned. The audit creates friction, yes, but it forces governance hygiene early. We mandate safety inspections for bridges. Why not for high-tech ventures carrying millions in public liability? The source cites incomplete assignment agreements as rampant. These are ticking time bombs. A hard gate disarms them before they explode.
All right. It discourages the scrappy, non-traditional founders who don't have a legal team on retainer. The risk here is that you create a system that favors the polished, well-connected spin-outs from major universities who have technology transfer offices doing this work for them. The two guys in a garage with a breakthrough, they fail the audit. You might inadvertently consolidate innovation into the hands of the incumbents.
That's a legitimate risk, which is why the second part of the proposal is so important: education and stress testing. This moves us to the human cost of this governance failure. Policy Hypothesis 5.2 suggests integrating cap table stress testing into accelerator curricula.
This is the who gets paid discussion. It's always the hardest part of the conversation.
It is, and it's shocking how many brilliant scientists just do not understand the math of their own equity. The source material points out that successful deals, where the technology is bought and used, often result in the founders getting zero recovery.
Right, we're talking about liquidation preferences?
Correct, and let's just explain that for the listeners because it creates a massive misalignment. If an investor puts in $10 million with a 2x liquidation preference, they are guaranteed to get back $20 million before the founders see a dime. So if the company sells for $15 million, which sounds like a success, the investors take it all. The founders, who spent 5 years building the tech, walk away with nothing.
And the argument is that this destroys the ecosystem's engine. If you wipe out the founders, they don't start new companies. You lose the motivational power of equity participation.
Exactly. We're recycling talent back into the ecosystem with increased skepticism and zero capital. The source argues we have a duty to force founders to model these exits, show them the spreadsheet. If you sign this term sheet and you sell for $30 million, you get zero.
Look, I'm sympathetic to the founders. It's heartbreaking to see that happen. But I have to play the devil's advocate regarding the state's role here. These are private contracts between consenting adults, sophisticated investors, and ostensibly sophisticated founders. If a founder signs a bad deal because they're desperate for cash, is it really the government's job to hold their hand?
It isn't holding their hand. It's balancing the information asymmetry. The VC has a team of analysts modeling these scenarios. The founder has a scientific hypothesis and a burn rate. The source argues that public policy relies on the recycling of talent. If that recycling mechanism is broken because of predatory term sheets, the public policy fails. We're not banning the terms, we're mandating that the founders understand them.
But does understanding change the leverage? That's my skepticism. The blind spot mentioned in the source is real. Founders are blind to the outcome. But even if they see it, if the choice is take the bad terms or close the company today, they're going to take the bad terms. A stress test in a curriculum doesn't print money. It just informs the founder of exactly how they're going to get squeezed.
But it changes the negotiation before the desperation sets in. If we signal that equitable cap tables are a metric of company health, a metric that future public funders will look at, it gives the founder leverage. They can say, I can't sign this 3x preference because it will disqualify me from the next round of NSF funding. It uses the state's weight to push back against predatory private terms.
Okay, that's an interesting mechanic, using public eligibility as leverage in a private negotiation. I can see the utility there. However, this leads us to the most controversial proposal in the material, Hypothesis 5.3, using public money to pay for the lawyers.
Transaction readiness.
Right. The proposal is to explicitly allow and even encourage the use of grant funds for data rooms, tech transfer protocols, and legal counsel. You want to take taxpayer money allocated for research and development and spend it on M&A attorneys.
I want to spend it on asset preservation. The source material challenges the definition of overhead. We usually think of legal costs as waste, But in biotech, legal costs are structural. If you don't build the data room, that secure repository where potential buyers can verify the science and the IP, you can't sell the asset. The material argues that transaction costs are a barrier to entry. If we don't fund them, the startups face transaction pressure. They run out of cash, they can't afford the diligence process, and they end up selling in a distressed state.
But think about the optics and the incentives. You're subsidizing the exit. If the taxpayer pays for the data room in the legal prep, we're essentially packaging the company up with a bow for the acquirer. And who is the acquirer? The source material notes that in Canada and Europe, the acquirers are frequently foreign entities. So the taxpayer funds the science. The taxpayer funds the lawyers to pack up the IP, and then the asset moves offshore. That feels like a perversion of the national competitiveness mandate.
I understand that reaction. It feels like we're paying for our own looting. But we have to look at the counterfactual provided in the analysis. If we don't pay for the transaction readiness, what happens? The company doesn't magically stay independent and domestic. Instead, it hits the wall. The IP lapses, the staff is fired, the knowledge just dissipates, or it's bought out of bankruptcy for pennies on the dollar, still by that foreign entity, but the founders get nothing, and the ecosystem gets no return.
So the argument is that we're choosing between a value-preserving licensing deal and a total loss.
Precisely. The material notes that without this funding, assets are no longer practically commercializable. A messy asset is unbuyable. By funding the cleanup, we ensure that someone pays fair market value for the innovation. We capture the value even if we lose the asset itself.
But this leads to a really dangerous definition of success. This is Hypothesis 5.4, redefining success to include value preservation, even if the company dissolves. You're suggesting that if a startup dies but manages to license its patent to Big Pharma, the government should mark that down as a win in its annual report?
Yes. Because we need to distinguish between scientific failure and governance failure. If the science works but the startup vehicle fails, the science should survive. If we stigmatize the dissolution of the company, we force founders to hold on too long, creating zombie companies.
Zombie companies?
Companies that are alive in name only. They have no capital to deploy, but they refuse to license their IP because they don't want to admit defeat. The IP just sits on a shelf gathering dust. The source argues we should encourage strategic dissolution. Recognize the company can't make it, sell the IP to someone who can, and recycle the talent.
Here is my deep concern with that logic. If we start counting IP sales as wins, we create a perverse incentive structure for the entire industry. We risk turning our national innovation system into an IP farm. We fund the seeds, we grow the seedlings, and then we immediately sell them to other nations to plant in their fields. We become a feeder league.
Is that worse than the current situation?
It might be. Because if we accept IP export as a success, we stop fighting for the harder goal, domestic manufacturing capacity. The source specifically warns about the loss of strategic autonomy. If we tell program managers, don't worry if you don't build any factories, just make sure the patents are sold at a good price, we erode our industrial base. We might get some cash back, but we lose the capability to make things.
That is a valid fear. But the source argues that we are currently losing both. We are losing the industrial base because the companies die, and we are losing the financial return because the assets are distressed. The IP farm scenario is a step up from the graveyard scenario we're in now.
That is a bleak dichotomy. But I will concede that the lack of data makes it hard to argue against. The text notes a systemic learning limitation. We don't even know why most companies fail because we don't track governance metrics. We just see them disappear.
Exactly. We label it all high risk, but we aren't differentiating. If a bridge collapses, we investigate if it was the design or the materials.
In startups, we just shrug and say, well, most startups fail. My argument, and the argument of the source, is that we can engineer a lower failure rate, but we have to stop treating legal costs as optional.
I want to circle back to the transaction readiness funding for a moment. There's a nuance here that I think actually supports your side, interestingly enough.
Oh, do tell.
It's about democratization. We discussed earlier how the hard gate might hurt the scrappy founders. But if the grant pays for the lawyers, it actually levels the playing field. Right now, the rich founders have good lawyers. The poor founders have, LegalZoom. If the grant explicitly covers transaction readiness, the poor founder gets the same quality of asset protection as the rich one.
That is a crucial point. It transforms governance from a luxury good into a public utility. It ensures that the merit of the science, not the depth of the founder's pocketbook, determines the outcome.
I can get on board with that aspect. However, I still worry about the distraction element. The source mentions the tension between scientific milestones and governance milestones. If we force scientists to think about cap tables and data rooms too early, do we dilute their focus?
I would answer that with a question. Is a distracted scientist better than a bankrupt one?
Touché.
But more seriously, the distraction is already there. The distraction of running out of cash, of fearing lawsuits, of managing disgruntled co-founders. Good governance removes distraction. A clean cap table is quiet. A messy cap table is noisy. By enforcing hygiene, we are actually clearing the mental decks for the science.
A fair argument.
But let's look at the implementation reality. The source talks about design levers. Levers can be pulled too hard. If you mandate audits, stress tests, and transaction protocols, you're essentially turning the startup into a quasi-governmental entity. You are adding layers of compliance. Innovation thrives on agility.
Innovation thrives on constraints.
That's a philosophical stance.
It is, but look at the evidence. The laissez-faire approach to governance has resulted in the valley of death becoming a canyon. We have billions in stranded assets. The market has failed to solve this coordination problem. The source argues that validated science is not simply potential waiting to be realized. It requires deliberate design. We are designing the container for the science. If the container leaks, the science is lost.
Okay, I accept the diagnosis. The valley of death is absolutely a governance problem as much as a capital one. And I will agree that the dual risk paradigm is a necessary intellectual shift. We cannot just fund science and hope for the best.
But
I stop short of fully endorsing the transaction readiness subsidies without stricter guardrails on who the transaction is with. If we use public funds to prep companies for sale, there should perhaps be strings attached regarding domestic retention. Otherwise, we're just greasing the wheels of the exit ramp for our competitors.
That is a nuance the source material alludes to, the need to balance value capture with strategic autonomy. It's a difficult balance. But my rebuttal is that until we fix the leakage, we don't have anything to keep or to sell. We are bleeding out. First, stop the bleeding. Then, we can decide where the patient goes for rehab.
Stop the bleeding. That's effectively what these policy hypotheses are. A tourniquet.
A tourniquet for the innovation ecosystem. We need mandatory audits to know what we own. We need cap table stress tests to keep founders in the game. And we need to fund the legal architecture so that our startups can stand toe-to-toe with global acquirers and get a fair deal.
And I'll summarize my position by saying, apply the tourniquet, but be careful not to cut off the circulation entirely. Governance is essential, but it must serve the science, not the other way around. We must be wary of creating a class of professional startup bureaucrats who are great at audits but terrible at innovation.
Agreed. The goal is alignment, not obstruction.
And perhaps the most important takeaway for our listeners, whether you're a founder, an investor, or a policymaker, is to look at the fine print. The source makes it clear the details of ownership are not administrative trivia. They are the destiny of the technology.
Governance-dependent assets. The science only matters if the structure survives.
A sobering thought for a field that loves to dream big.
Indeed. Thank you for joining us on The Debate. We hope this conversation has illuminated the invisible machinery that turns ideas into impact.
Until next time, keep reading the fine print.
As we sign off on this episode's look at treating licensing as a core objective, remember, the revolution in biotech is just beginning. Join us next time for policy shifts and sustainable wins. Follow and subscribe now to Biomanufacturing and Fermentation Technology by Prasad Urnala. Let's innovate together.